We interrupt our program to bring you this important message.
You're listening to Carousel Sniper Victim, a Dead Glass Design production, with your host, Sean Jeffrey.
A span of the new Westgate Bridge in Melbourne collapsed today, killing at least 28 people and injuring many others. Rescue crews are digging under piles of twisted metal and wood to try and locate 21 men. This is Bob Wilcox in Melbourne, reporting for ABC viewers in all Australian states. The Victorian Premier, Sir Henry Bolte, announced tonight that a royal commission will investigate the disaster. He said the terms of reference of the commission would be decided by a judge who had yet to be appointed. From the scene, Martin Goddard.
Just before midday today, a huge section of the Westgate Bridge collapsed. The section which now lies in the Yarra mud was a steel shell, which was to be filled with concrete to form part of the bridge's roadway. The span which collapsed was 382 feet long. It fell from a height of 150 feet. According to eyewitnesses, the section of the bridge broke its back along a central seam. There was virtually no warning for the men working inside. According to doctors, dead and injured are in approximately equal numbers. As yet, there is still no firm indication of the numbers of men still inside the wreckage.
A massive rescue operation got underway within minutes of the collapse. Doctors and nurses from nearby hospitals were rushed to the scene. The injured have been taken to 4 Melbourne hospitals, where special casualty teams are standing by. Mobile cranes are being used to raise the collapsed span as rescuers dig through mud and rubble for the missing men. Part of the span fell out over an inlet of the River Yarra. Divers are searching the thick mud and shallow water for bodies. The Assistant Police Commissioner at the scene, Mr. Braybrook, has asked for any workers who were on the bridge today and who left without checking with police to contact Russell Street Police Headquarters. 68 men were working on and near the span when it collapsed. There were emotional scenes in the area as workmen recovered bodies from under the tons of mud and rubble. The collapse of the span was witnessed by a number of workmen and motorists.
One tremendous wreckage of steel, mud, slush. It was something shocking.
Were you able to help any of the distressed people?
We helped one fellow out of a crane, or part of the crane that was there. Apparently he was the crane driver, and we helped him out of the situation he was in. And a few workmen came along and took him away then, yes. Right alongside this crane was a shed on fire, and we could hear people scream, but there wasn't anything we could do. We had a look at a couple of the manholes in the top, and we could see bodies down below. We could hear people scream, but there wasn't anything we could do at that stage, at that stage, at that stage, at that stage.
Melbourne's iconic Westgate Bridge has long been a bridge over troubled waters in the Australian state of Victoria. The bridge itself is one of the most notable and unique structures in the city of Melbourne. It spans the Yarra River and connects 2 vital locations of the city. Located just towards the north entrance of Port Phillip, the bridge serves as a vital link between the capital's outer western suburbs and the inner city. This remarkable bridge adjoins the famous Westgate Park, so those who love nature can explore and enjoy the vast environmental and recreational reserves, whilst also getting a view of the famous bridge. But despite these picturesque surroundings, Westgate Bridge has long cast a dark physical and emotional shadow over the city of Melbourne. 2 years into its construction, at 11:50 a.m. on the 15th of October, 1970, the 112-metre, 367-foot span between Piers 10 and 11 collapsed and fell 50 metres, 164 feet, to the ground and water below. 35 construction workers were killed and 18 injured, and it remains Australia's worst industrial accident to this day. Many of those who perished were on lunch break beneath the structure in workers' huts, which were crushed by the falling debris. Others were working on and inside the span when it fell. The whole 2,000-tonne mass plummeted into the Yarra River mud with an explosion of gas, dust and mangled metal that shook buildings hundreds of metres away. Nearby houses were splattered with flying mud. The roar of the impact, the explosion, and the fire that followed could be clearly heard over 20 kilometres away. Six twisted fragments of the collapsed bridge can be found today adorning the gardens in the engineering faculty of Monash University's Clayton campus. It is said by students that they are there to remind engineers of the consequences of their errors. Construction resumed in 1972 and was completed in 1978, and at a cost of 35 human lives. The Westgate Bridge was only just getting started as the grim backdrop to unfolding horrors that were yet to come. Police data shows up to one attempted suicide occurs every 3 weeks at the Westgate Bridge. A 2004 coroner's report recommended that anti-suicide fencing or barriers be erected on the bridge to deter people from attempting to end their lives. In 2008, the bodies of a mother in her late 20s and her 18-month-old baby were found on the riverbank below the Westgate Bridge. This prompted further calls to erect a suicide barrier. Those who argued for a suicide barrier claimed that most of those who jump from the Westgate Bridge do so through impulse, and that police officers who try to save those who try to jump are putting their own lives in danger. There have been multiple incidents of police officers dangling off the side of the bridge while holding on to would-be jumpers. Many of those who landed in the water, surviving the fall, drowned afterwards. Now, tragically, this is the fate that met an innocent little 4-year-old girl, Darcy Iris Freeman. Now, obviously 4-year-old girls aren't statistically predisposed to, or likely to commit suicide. Darcy Freeman was thrown from the Westgate Bridge, hurled into the abyss by the one person that should have been her ultimate protector, her father. Mad or bad? The appearance of Arthur Freeman at his murder trial supported either theory. His locks, streaked blonde, tumbled over the collar of the black suit that he wore each day of the trial. Strands of hair, as though reaching for the sun, on his otherwise bare head suggested a close relationship with a power plug, or that, maybe he got his style advice from Beetlejuice. His forehead looked to be carved with a hammer and chisel. As Freeman shuffled in each morning, shackles clanking, shoulders hunched, and his body resembled a block of concrete, wide and thick. Sometimes Freeman bared his teeth in expressions of pain. He whimpered and wept and guzzled water as he heard the evidence being presented against him. Mostly, he stared with wide eyes, like a zoo exhibit who couldn't grasp how he'd arrived where he was. Chief Crown Prosecutor Gavin Silbert, SC, said that he had the, quote, Rasputin-like appearance of a mad monk, end quote. Freeman was an unfortunately creepy-looking dude. However, Arthur Freeman hadn't always been this dishevelled-looking madman. Indeed, for 35 years, right up until one early morning, January 29th of 2009, Arthur Freeman was considered harmless. He was an IT geek who had shone as a database administrator in London. He played tennis weekly. He kept busy with bike rides and tinkering around the house as he always had as a little boy. There were beers and skiing trips and a life led, from school onwards, under the radar. It would seem that being extremely ordinary was Arthur Freeman's thing. More than anything else, though, it seems, he wanted more time with his 3 kids who, for a stretch, he had cared for full time. He played beach soccer with his 2 sons and would take his daughter, Darcy, to ballet recitals. Darcy would often seek out her dad for a big hug. Then, one fateful morning in January of 2009, Freeman tossed his daughter Darcy off of the highest point of the Westgate Bridge. According to one of many witnesses, no single act of recent times has haunted us like the Westgate Bridge girl.
The 4-year-old stood little chance. It's Melbourne's tallest bridge, and she was dropped nearly 60 metres into the Yarra River. The tragic result, it's thought, of a custody battle.
A male in that vehicle has taken a young girl, we believe to be 4 years of age, and dropped her over the bridge, and she's landed in the water here at the bottom.
It took paramedics 10 minutes to reach the child. Miraculously, she was still alive. Named locally as Darcy Freeman, she received treatment on the riverside and was then flown to the city's Royal Children's Hospital. She died later, suffering from horrendous internal injuries. The incident happened shortly after 9 a.m. local time. Witnesses said they saw the Toyota Land Cruiser on the bridge's near side lane. A man, thought to be the child's father, was seen throwing the little girl from the bridge. 2 other children, also in the car, were unharmed. Within 2 hours, 36-year-old Arthur Philip Freeman was arrested.
He was seen walking around the federal court with 2 young children, was visibly distressed, and as I say, the vehicle that we were looking for was seen parked out at the front of the court. So people working at the federal court have put 2 and 2 together.
He's being held at a Melbourne police station but is yet to be questioned, doctors warning that he's suffering from acute psychological distress.
You just shudder, you just think, how can that happen? And it's just such a terrible thing.
The other 2 children are now thought to be with their mother. Mark Stone, Sky News.
It was meant to be her first day of school. Darcy Iris Freeman was just a couple of days off turning 5. Her father had promised to take her and her older brothers to their primary school that morning. No one knows what made Arthur Philip Freeman apparently change his mind. Not his lawyers, who could not believe what happened, not the police, who could get no sense out of him, nor the forensic psychiatrist, who concluded that he was not fit to plead, and certainly not little Darcy, who would never get the chance to ask him. It began on a hot morning after a sweltering night. Freeman had apparently taken all 3 of his children to a beach house overnight to escape Melbourne's blistering heat. Coming back into town, the traffic across the Westgate Bridge was slow. But what police say happened in front of horrified witnesses happened fast. So fast, police would claim later that there was no chance for anyone to stop it. Just after 9 a.m, Freeman's white Toyota Land Cruiser, driving in towards the city, slowed in the left-hand lane, and then it stopped. Freeman put the hazard lights on his Land Cruiser. He then got out of the car. He walked to the rear passenger door. His 2 sons, Benjamin 6 and Jack 2, were in the back seat. But he leaned in and told Darcy to climb into the front seat. He then opened the door. He lifted her up and carried her to the edge of the bridge near its highest point. Witnesses later told police that the child seemed limp. She didn't fight, she didn't protest. Those who had witnessed what happened next have struggled with the events even years later. Freeman allegedly walked to the edge of the bridge, lifted his daughter up over the railing, and let her go. Darcy fell past the railings, past the lines of cars and past the pylons. She hurtled 58 metres into the murky waters of the Yarra River below. Her father got back into his car and drove off. Frantic motorists and witnesses were already calling the police. As Freeman drove away from the bridge after murdering Darcy, his 6-year-old son Ben urged him to turn back. Darcy can't swim, he told his father. It was the water police who got to Darcy first. They dragged the little girl from the water at a spot quite near the local children's hospital. She was in a critical condition, suffering massive internal injuries. Meanwhile, a massive police hunt swung into action. Police, now searching for this white Land Cruiser, feared that they may find a second crime scene. But at around 10:30 a.m, they were called to the Commonwealth Law Courts in the city centre. This building houses the Family Law Court and the Federal Magistrates Court, which also handles family law cases. Now, understandably so, as these family court hearings can be high stress and high anxiety environments. Security staff there are trained to recognise people in distress. They phoned police after noticing a man in the foyer crying and shaking uncontrollably. He looked, one would say later, like he'd had enough. His 2 sons were clinging to him, and the man begged security guards to take the children. He was having trouble talking. It was his older son who gave the guards the parents' names. When police arrived, Freeman was arrested and handcuffed. Family friends were called to the court to collect the children. Freeman's ex-wife, Peter Freeman, rushed to the hospital to be with her daughter, who died at 1:35 p.m. Peter Freeman, Darcy Freeman's mum, had to make the heart-wrenching decision to switch off her daughter's life support. It is believed that while in police custody, Arthur Freeman was unable to utter a single word. He was shaking and weeping, apparently in deep shock. He would be charged with murder that same day.
Jurors were today shown video footage of the man who threw his young daughter off the Westgate Bridge, taken shortly after the incident. Arthur Freeman is trembling and appears withdrawn. One doctor told the court the pictures showed a man who was falling apart.
This is vision of Arthur Freeman less than an hour after he'd thrown his daughter to her death. He appears to be shaking, as if sobbing uncontrollably, and remains frozen to the spot for half an hour. He'd driven straight to the federal court precinct from the Westgate Bridge. Court guard Rashif Aziz told the jury when the 37-year-old man first arrived at the security checkpoint, he'd been asked to put his possessions through an X-ray machine. He tried to pass me his child, he said. In most of the vision, which can't be shown, Arthur Freeman's 6- and 2-year-old sons remain close by his side, but he appears oblivious to their presence and remains unresponsive to concerned workers. The trial heard Freeman was later arrested at the court precinct. Sobbing loudly, he simply said, "Take me away." Dr. Justin Duplessis assessed Freeman to see if he was fit to be interviewed by police. The doctor told the court Freeman sat hunched over, shaking and crying, and didn't answer questions. He said he appeared to be in acute psychic distress, in layman's terms, falling apart or unable to keep it together. Under questioning, the doctor agreed Freeman could have been in a state of shock after throwing his daughter off the Westgate Bridge. It was the water police who found the 4-year-old girl. The court heard as the police boat came down the Yarra River, the officers on board saw what looked like a doll floating in the water. It was Darcy Freeman's limp and badly bruised body. Her father maintains he was mentally impaired when he threw her over the railings. Sarah Farnsworth.
A Supreme Court jury, made up of 7 women and 5 men, eventually found Arthur Freeman guilty on the 11th of April 2011. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with a non-parole period of 32 years. Witnesses during the trial recalled their shock at seeing Freeman throw the little girl from the bridge. Barry Nelson, who was driving to work with his wife, said he saw the child's hair and limbs flying. He said Freeman appeared to show no sign of aggression or emotion. Quote, "He may as well have been posting a letter." One doctor said Freeman's behaviour at the Commonwealth Law Courts, where he handed himself into security guards and where he was captured on CCTV footage trembling and crying, indicated that he was, quote, catastrophically overwhelmed by the enormity of what he had done. In a devastating tape interview played to the jury, Ben Freeman, who was 6 years old at the time, Darcy's brother, said he and Darcy and Jackson were playing games in the back of the car before they stopped on the bridge, and his father asked his sister to get into the front seat. He said his father carried Darcy against his shoulder before throwing her over the side. He remembered he didn't hear her scream as she fell out of sight.
The jury has heard video evidence from a 6-year-old boy who watched his father throw his little sister off the Westgate Bridge. Benjamin Freeman said he asked his father to help 4-year-old Darcy Freeman, but his plea fell on deaf ears. Arthur Freeman is on trial for his daughter's murder.
Arthur Freeman entered court to hear his son recount on video the horrific events of the 29th of January 2009. The then 6-year-old Benjamin Freeman said his father stopped the family car on the Westgate Bridge and, without saying anything, picked up 4-year-old Darcy Freeman and dropped her over the safety barrier. She didn't even scream in her fall. I didn't hear any scream. Arthur Freeman then got back in the car, put his seatbelt on and slowly drove away. Benjamin told his interviewer, "I said go back and get her, and I said Darcy can't swim," but he kept on driving. He didn't go back and get her. Arthur Freeman watched his son's interview intently with a furrowed brow and his mouth agape. He hardly blinked and never took his eyes off the screen. Michael Piacentini says he sees Darcy Freeman's death every time he crosses the bridge. He dialed 000.
Hello, I've just witnessed a man throw a child over the Westgate Bridge.
Barry Nelson said he asked Arthur Freeman, "What are you doing?" but there was no reply. He also called for help.
I'm still at the Westgate Bridge at the crime scene, yeah. And we can see the child floating in the water, yeah.
He told the jury Arthur Freeman appeared calm and could have been going to the post box to get a letter. Paramedics said they briefly regained a pulse in their efforts to revive Darcy Freeman, but it lasted less than a minute. The defence says Arthur Freeman was mentally ill at the time of the crime. Guy Stainer, ABC News.
Arthur Freeman showed no reaction throughout the majority of the hearing, but he did have to be pulled from the courtroom by 3 guards following a bizarre outburst after the sentence was handed down. Freeman backed into a corner of the dock to avoid guards as he accused an in-law of being implicated in the theft of diamonds from a West Australian Argyle diamond mine, and ranted about federal police phone taps, while he also mentioned death threats to himself. During a 40-minute statement that had finished moments earlier, Justice Coghlan said Freeman had not shown remorse or even begun to understand the enormity of his brutal crime. Quote, "You are yet to say sorry for what you have done." Prosecutors had called for Freeman to be jailed for life without parole, while his lawyers had pleaded for a minimum term. In handing down the life sentence, the judge said he understood the argument that he should be, quote, "locked away forever," but he was obliged to consider other factors. Quote, "Whatever happens, you will spend what you may consider will be the best years of your life in prison. You are responsible for it, and nobody else. The earliest date you can be released is January 29th, 2041, when you will be 67 years old." Darcy's mother, Peter, showed no emotion at the sentencing and left the court with supporters without really making a statement. Several members of the jury that convicted Freeman were also in court to hear the verdict. Justice Coghlan, in handing down his sentence, said Freeman's actions were aggravated by an act breaching the basic trust of father and child, and that he had destroyed the lives of others. Quote, "This was a killing of an innocent child. The circumstances of the killing were horrible. The throwing of your 4-year-old daughter from a bridge more than 50 metres above the ground could not be more horrible. What Darcy's last thoughts might have been does not bear thinking about, and her death must have been painful and a protracted one." The judge said that Freeman's actions were a fundamental breach of trust and an attack on the institution of family. He said that the death was made worse because, Freeman had killed Darcy in the presence of his 2 young sons, Ben, 6, and Jack, 2. Quote, "It can only be concluded that you used your daughter in an attempt to hurt your former wife as profoundly as possible." He said that Freeman could not have chosen a more public place for the murder act, saying it had offended the sensibilities of the entire community. He said the lives of Darcy's mother and many others would never be the same. In describing the impact on other people, Justice Coughlan said, "Emergency services, witnesses and the community as a whole had been affected by Darcy's death, by having the events that you perpetrated forced upon them."
A psychiatrist has told a Melbourne court the man who threw his daughter off the Westgate Bridge was probably psychotic at the time. Key defence witness Professor Graham Burrows emphatically rejected the suggestion that Arthur Freeman was trying to get back at his ex-wife. He believes he was suffering from severe depression.
Eminent Professor Graham Burrows is the defence's only witness and believes Arthur Freeman had a major depressive disorder when he threw his 4-year-old off the Westgate Bridge. He said Freeman was in a state of dissociation, as if sleepwalking or hypnotised, and didn't really know what he was doing. But he said it was a fluctuating illness, which meant he was still able to get his children ready for school, negotiate safely through peak hour traffic, carry out phone conversations, and put his hazard lights on when he parked on the bridge, all before he dropped the little girl over the railings. Professor Burrows admitted he only met Arthur Freeman 13 months after the event, but he thinks he was probably psychotic. He still doesn't believe that it occurred. He still doesn't believe that he could have done it, he said. Prosecutor Gavin Silbert called the professor a psychiatrist of last resort. Mr. Silbert said 4 different psychiatrists saw Arthur Freeman before he was assessed by Professor Burrows, and none of them diagnosed him as psychotic. Under heated questioning, Professor Burrows rejected Freeman killed his daughter in an act of spousal revenge, despite his angry calls to his ex-wife telling her to say goodbye to her children. The Crown argued not all men who kill their children are mad, but Professor Burrows maintains Freeman was disturbed and very sick. The trial continues in 7 months.
One insight into Arthur Freeman's formative thinking may lie in a poem that he wrote in 1986. He would have been about 12 years old. It was considered good enough to be published in the school yearbook, called Feelings. Freeman described fear as when you're in a maze with a tiger behind you. You run for your life, then the tiger jumps you. But here comes your dad. So now you're glad that you have a dad. Then he goes, so you're angry and mad, but you still love your dad. The poem's second stanza took on a sort of Dr. Seuss kind of cadence, and the last 4 lines would acquire a weird prescience after Darcy's death. A forensic psychologist on recently reading the poem wrongly assumed that Freeman had been raised from a broken home. It was actually written by a boy who, later as a man and a father, murdered his daughter, but is said to still try to write letters to his sons from jail. It may be tempting for a lot of people, even some of Freeman's former school peers, to write him off as a sort of aberration of nature. Almost everyone appears to do just that. His single act defines him. It hardly matters whether a court of law found Freeman insane or not. He didn't just condemn his daughter and ex-wife. His own family is burdened with a grief that may never fade. The Freemans didn't lose one family member. They lost as many as 4 that day. One school peer, whose impressions were supported by some of his other mates at the time, spoke at great length to the Herald Sun newspaper. He was in Arthur Freeman's classes several times, and he liked him well enough to request a Facebook friendship many years later. It was actually just a few months before Darcy died. The offer of Facebook friendship wasn't taken up. Quote, "He was like a Martin Bryant type. That look. he'd get that stare. Bloody oath, it was scary. It was when he got bullied a bit and he'd had too much, but at the end of the day, he was a likeable sort of dude. They picked on him because he was harmless, but everyone knew he had that ability, that something inside him could just explode at any minute. This cunt threw his kid off the Westgate Bridge. And for what? End quote. Darcy's final glimpses of life, her panic, her confusion. Such reflections smash at even the hardest of hearts. No one can quite explain how or why this happened. Not then and not now. Even those at Freeman's murder trial concluded that the more they knew, the more they didn't know at all. The killer himself, it was said that he had no memory of the incident, and nowadays, to keep busy, he tends to the tomatoes in the prison garden. Apparently the tomatoes are doing well. Freeman likes to talk tomatoes, but apparently he doesn't like to talk about his daughter's death. I wonder why. Perhaps bad memories.
These waters run, these waters flow, and time's washed down as melted snow. There sleeps the unnamed girl laid low. We tangled hair pulled to and fro, her life dragged to the undertow, down by the bridge of Dee. All Hallows Eve left ghosts there, in bonfire nights chill wood smoked air. Her same old path to home seemed strange, that friendly way so rearranged. Each well-known tree took evil shape, down by the bridge of Dee. She's crossed Dean Bridge and dropped down right, and left behind safe city's lights, gone wandering home quite out of sight. Each bang and flash, a firework bright, left her shaking by the riverside, down by the bridge of Dean. So scared she runs for Saunders Street, in tripping steps and heart-skip beat, while man-made thunder splits the sky. Hygeia cries, she runs by, but the roaring river spurs her on, down by the bridge of Dean. That creeping feeling, something's wrong. She's glancing back and running on, down to the arch and almost there. A hand grabs out behind the stair. Why can no one hear her screaming there, down by the bridge of Dee? The healing drafts sent Bernard's well. They could not help her as she fell. Down in the water still she lies, with reaching hands and pleading eyes, but no one knows as they walk by, down by the bridge of Dee. No sign to mark the place, save a lonely pink glove half buried in mud. Oh, sing on high, you church bells toll, an hourly mass to the unnamed girl, for her lonely, lost, forgotten soul, down by the bridge of Dee.